So this podcast picks up where the previous one left off, and that was with Cortez dealing with the problem on the coast, the problem that was sent by Diego Velázquez. He had sent Panfilo Narvaez to arrest Cortez, but Cortez was able to convince Narvaez's men to cease their pursuit of him and really join his side to go back to Tenochtitlan. So Cortez was on his way back to the capital. He had now got about 1,000 more men, almost 100 more guns, almost 100 more horses. So this really served as reinforcements to him. So Cortez had left Alvarado in charge in the city. And Alvarado was a man of less patience than Cortez, let's say. And he really acted on simply greed, it seems, in this instance. There was a gathering of nobles in Tenochtitlan, and Alvarado essentially massacred them and stole their gold. And this obviously prompted a very, very negative reaction from the other people of Tenochtitlan. When Cortez returned, he found that the people of the city had really begun to turn on the Spanish. Previously, they had enjoyed a kind of, tenuous calm throughout the city. Now, open attacks began against the Spanish. Cortez himself, in a letter to the king, described Alvarado's actions less than positively. Quote, Alvarado covered each of the entrances with 10 or 12 Spaniards and went inside with more than 50 Spaniards, and without remorse and lacking any Christian piety, they brutally stabbed and killed the Indians and took what they were wearing. Unquote. So for Cortez to describe these events as such really tells us something. Cortez, of course, a Christian, using language like that, it really meant something in this letter to the king. And so Cortez, he really tries to keep things together. He does his best. He thinks he has an ace in the hole. Remember, Montezuma is under house arrest at this time, and so Cortez wants to use him to convince the people of the city to kind of, cease their aggressive nature towards the Spanish. Montezuma goes out his balcony. He gives a speech to his people where he calls for calm. They essentially reject him. They start to scream at him, throw rocks and darts, and different sources tell us different things about how these events, progressed from here. One way or another, Montezuma's people were sick of him. They had had enough. They viewed him as too weak. He was a man who was respected. Remember, he was elected to this post by a small group of nobles, so he was an able man. But in this case, they had chosen a new king, Cuitlahuac. And so Montezuma realizes that he had no power over the people. He was unable to control them. And as the Spanish tell it, the rocks essentially led to his death, the rocks that were thrown by the people of Tenochtitlan. As an indigenous source tells it, Montezuma returned from giving this speech. He may have been hit by a rock, may have been hit by some type of dart, but really it was the Spanish that then essentially killed him. They may have suffocated him in the back, essentially, because he was useless to them now. Without Montezuma having the respect of his people, he served no purpose for the Spanish. And this was always one of their goals, to capture the leader, not to kill him, to capture him and kind of use his power that he had over the local people to their advantage, to rule through the leader, in this case, to rule through Montezuma. So from this point on, the Spanish are pretty much just under attack by the people of Tenochtitlan, and it's not a full onslaught yet. It's kind of guerrilla tactics, small little skirmishes, but the Spanish are dying. They're losing soldiers daily. And so what Cortez decides that they must do is they must flee the city. They have to give up their position. And remember, they had been there for months at this point. This is now June 30th, 1520. They arrived in the city for the first time on November 8th, 1519. So we're over half a year at this point of just their time in the city. Of course, that's not to mention the months and months they spent traveling to the city. So they decide on June 30th that they will flee under cover of darkness. They'll flee at night. And as this night would eventually be known as La Noche Triste, the sad night, that should give you some indication of how things went for the Spanish here. They lost hundreds of soldiers as they fled. Essentially, they were crossing one of the causeways, and immediately, almost an alarm was sounded, and boats descended upon them, soldiers descended upon them from either end of the causeway. The drawbridges in the causeways were raised, and the Spanish found themselves just overwhelmed by the forces that were pitted against them. And as I said, hundreds of soldiers died here. Cortez says 150. Gomara, his biographer, says 450. Diaz, who oftentimes is the most rational of our sources, says 860. However, that might not have been just that single night. It might have been over the course of the ensuing week, where the army of Tenochtitlan pursued the Spanish. And so that illustrates an important fact that the people of Tenochtitlan, the military, its leaders, average citizens, they were not willing to sit back passively as these events unfolded. They pursued the Spanish. They were not going to wait till they came to them again. They tried to finish them off. Cuitlahuac, the new king of the city, he was determined to destroy the Spanish. They were unable to, but either way, it's likely that over half the Spaniards were killed in about 8 days. The Battle of Otumba, the kind of culmination of their retreat, took place on July 8th. And this is significant because it does show us that these two sides were perhaps evenly matched for a time being here. It wasn't inevitable that Cortez would win this battle. Cuitlahuac, as good a leader as he was for a short period of time, actually contracted smallpox several months after taking power. And so this shows the significance of disease within the conflict here. Smallpox had been brought by one of the people aboard the Narvaez expedition that was sent to arrest Cortez. And just as Cortez and his soldiers suffer this massive defeat on La Noche Triste, smallpox basically arrives in Tenochtitlan. Thousands of people die in an epidemic from October to December of 1520. So at that point, it had been over a year since the Spanish first arrived. And while the epidemic of smallpox was hitting the city, the Spanish were essentially regrouping back in the city of Tlaxcala with their strong allies, the Tlaxcalans. And remember, they are the historic enemies of the Mexica of Tenochtitlan. And so the Spanish at this point probably received 20,000 or more soldiers from Tlaxcala to go back for the final battle at Tenochtitlan. So we're not sure about the exact numbers today, but it's likely that over the next several months, Cortez amassed an army of over 100,000. Some sources put the number closer to 200,000. Either way, the final battle is going to involve tens and tens and tens of thousands of soldiers on either side, both the side of Tenochtitlan and the side of the Spanish. But remember, the majority of the people fighting with the Spanish are not Spanish. The Spanish only make up a small percentage of the troops that are going to eventually destroy the city. Cortez probably only has at the beginning roughly 700 Spaniards. Reinforcements will arrive a couple of times following the beginning of the siege. But really, the Spanish are a small percentage, and that is one of the keys to understand here. That one of the reasons for the Spanish victory is because they had so many non-Spaniards fighting with them. They would have not been able to win the final battle were it just them alone. La Noche Triste proved that. Besides the native allies, we should note a few other factors just very, very explicitly that played a role in this Spanish victory. So, native allies, disease that was hitting the city, superior weapons, without a doubt. The Spanish were not distributing them to everybody, but the combination of the horse, armor, and steel sword proved superior to really, anything that locals had individually or put together. And fighting style actually played a role too. The Mexica were still trying to capture the Spanish as opposed to just kill them on the battlefield. Certainly they killed some, Spaniards died. But remember, their style of warfare was focused on capturing people for a later sacrifice. And yes, Spaniards were sacrificed during the final battle. Diaz tells us dozens were sacrificed. The final stages of the fall of Tenochtitlan began in late May of 1521. This is over 2 years after Cortez had initially left Cuba to begin his conquest of Mexico, to begin his search for this empire that was rumored to exist. So, in late May, Cortez and 100,000 plus native allies descended upon the city, but not into the city. They blocked the city's causeways. They essentially laid siege to the island. Remember, Tenochtitlan was an island connected to the mainland by several causeways. Without access to the mainland, the city had little hope of surviving. They could only grow 5% of their own food within the city. It was an urban city, not an agricultural city by any means. So Cortez planned to starve them into submission. Of course, that alone wouldn't be enough. They had to invade the city and attack, and tens of thousands were lost on either side. Hundreds of Spaniards, tens of thousands of native allies, tens of thousands of civilians in Tenochtitlan were killed. The majority of the people in the city, in fact, were killed. After several months of siege and battle in the city streets and canals, the Mexica eventually did surrender. But this was only after they had experienced just massive, massive destruction. Famine had already set in through the city. People were reported to have been eating wood, dirt, resorting to cannibalism. Things got pretty grim. Remember, the lake was brackish water. People were forced to drink salt water. This, of course, kills you. So things became pretty bleak. But it was not given up without a fight, that is for certain. Tens of thousands of people in the city, if not over 100,000, were killed. And the Spanish reported that everyone was fighting against them. As they moved through the city streets, people were throwing things down from the rooftops. Hot oil, hot water splashing down on the Spanish. Women were throwing things. So it was really an example of total war as they tried to destroy the city. And Cortez, once he had secured the surrender of the new king, Cuauhtemoc, who had taken over for Cuitlahuac, um, he didn't intend to kind of continue the destruction. And at one point, he suggested to the Allies that they cease their destruction of the city. However, they responded no. They hated Tenochtitlan. They hated the Mexica. So his allies kind of went beyond his orders here, whereas he would have liked to have ceased the fighting, have them surrender. They continued to destroy the city, to tear buildings down brick by brick, to kill civilians as well as the military. And this shows us that the Spanish, more so than being able to take credit for the entire conquest, really stepped into a local conflict. They were able to harness all of this negative energy throughout the region that existed towards the Mexica, towards Tenochtitlan. But by no means were they the sole conquerors of this city. Cortez was an excellent statesman, an excellent manipulator, if you will, of local tensions that had existed for decades and decades. But he was masterful in these ways. Either way, the final surrender occurred on August 13th, 1521. Hundreds of thousands of people had died, an empire had been destroyed, and new leaders began their rule over Mexico and really over much of the New World. For the Spanish would face a few challengers, at least for several decades.